Hi, everybody. Welcome to our Christian formation session from this past Sunday, which was September 24th, 2023. I was out of town, and so we gave our class a self-guided lesson to follow and no recording. So I thought I'd do a very short version of that, and you can see I have a screen share going with the handout that they had to follow. So we'll include a PDF of this somewhere on the website, so just look for that. But I wanted to, or in the email that goes out with the link to the website. But I thought I'd just walk you through the very most basic version of what they had, so you all can do this too at home. So our uh, class that we just started before I was gone for a week is called Cite Unseen, Less Than Obvious Old Testament References in the Gospels. The Gospels quote the Old Testament a lot, and even more than quoting, they also reference and allude to the Old Testament as well. So to better understand the Gospels and what the witness of the evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are, and what Jesus is doing when he quotes the Old Testament, to get a deeper meaning of these witnesses, we thought, well, let's find some of those connections and dig into them. For this week, we're looking at Matthew's Gospel. Um, and so uh, title of the class is about less than obvious references. Well, Matthew really likes to do obvious ones, direct quotes. So we're just going to cover some of the clear quotes and then move on to a couple of the less direct allusions. And the idea here is I'll do this little intro and then we'll share which passages, and I just want you to have a paper and a pencil ready or have this downloaded and just pause the video, read it yourself, and see what you think. I don't want to give all the answers this week. The idea is to dig in and discover. Starting again next Sunday, we'll get into some of the other Gospels, and we'll have the whole conversation and discussion recorded. But for this first week, I thought I could invite you all to, do this little bit of a scavenger hunt, play detective, Bible detective, and dig into these and see what you think. Um, because unless you have a study Bible that says, asterisk, refer back to this passage, unless you have the introduction in worship that comes before the reading that says, well, this is referencing Isaiah. You might not know that there's this, where the text is coming from, where the quotation is coming from. You might not know that there is a reference at all. So you get to put on your detective hats and see what you can find. Depending on which scholars you read, Matthew has something like 54 to 61 quotations of the Old Testament. That's just the direct quotations. If you get into allusions or echoes, references, there's hundreds of less direct references. Of the direct ones, 54, 61, somewhere in between, around 11 of them start with something like, this was to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet, what was spoken by Isaiah, something like that. So one of the authors, and I should have grabbed those books before we started. I'm using primarily two books from a course I did a couple years back. One is called Reading Backwards by Richard B. Hayes, Figural Christology and the Fourfold Gospel Witness. That's a lot, but it basically is the technical, both of these get into the technical biblical scholar stuff of, okay, well, here's what it talks about back then and why. The other one is by Steve Moise, The Old Testament in the New, an Introduction. There you go. So one scholar, where was I? There we go. Breaks down the direct quotations into three categories. So I'll just share those to give you just a sense of how these quotes are used or what's going on when the New Testament, when the Gospels quote the Old Testament. Number one, some are editorial comments by Matthew to explain something. There are quite a few of these in the infancy narratives. This was to fulfill what, was said uh, when Herod killed all the babies. This fulfilled this prophecy. It's Matthew as the narrator explaining something. Two, some are quotations on the lips of Jesus. One example would be when Jesus is being tempted by the devil in the wilderness, or when in Luke's gospel, when Jesus reads the scroll in front of everybody. That literally is a direct reading. And then number three, a few are quotations on the lips of others. For instance, the devil, also in that temptation story, Pharisees, Sadducees, even the crowd will sometimes quote scripture. In Matthew's particular witness to the good news, he does seem to have a particular goal to demonstrate that Jesus is indeed the promised Messiah, the fulfillment of the promises, the fulfillment of the prophets. Matthew's gospel begins, after all, with a genealogy running from Abraham all the way to Joseph, husband of Mary. Um, a lot of Matthew has to do with saying, yes, Jesus is the one. By the end of the gospel, Jesus promises to be with his followers to the end of the age, echoing many Old Testament passages where God declares that God will be with the people. So even something as simple as that, of that that well-known line at the end of the Gospels, remember I'm with you always to the end of the age. Remember I'm with you always. It's the part where, Jesus commands everybody to baptize in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, remembering everything I've taught you, and remember I'm with you always to the end of the age. So that could just be an echo, a reference to this theme, this motif throughout the Old Testament. Is it? Isn't it? Is it just something that's in Matthew's vocabulary because he's read the scriptures so much, doesn't even realize he's doing it? Either way, it ties in on some level. Now time to get into specific passages. For each one, I'm going to tell you the two verses in particular where it's quoted in Matthew and then what Old Testament line it's quoting. I'm going to give you then the fuller passages of each because it's always good to read these in context. I'll give you a little bit of background, and at that point, I invite you to pause the recording, read those, look it up, and then for each one, just some general questions, okay? So if you have more than one person doing this together, have different voices read the different passages, that's always nice. But then just look over each of these. So in the Matthew passage, who's speaking when the Old Testament is cited? That can give you some idea as to what's going on. Number two, what are the circumstances of the passage in Matthew? And number three, what is the context or circumstances of the passage in the Old Testament? Now, you might have to read wider than the verses I've given you. You might want to have a study Bible with you or a reliable source online to find more of the background pieces. And then number four, now that you've looked a little deeper, does that give you any new insights from the passage from Matthew, how it fits into the bigger story in the gospel? So those are the four questions for each of these. I think I've got 5 different citations and a few questions to go with each. So the first one is going to be Matthew 1:23. Grab my Bible. So Matthew 1:23. I'll just do the single verses with you, just so you know what we're talking about. But Matthew 1:23. It's from the infancy parts of the story of Jesus. In 1:23, Joseph has had a vision. And it says 22 and 23, all this took place to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet. Look, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall name him Emmanuel. Well, this references back to Isaiah chapter. Oh, I did that wrong. I left a colon out. Sorry for the typo, folks. It should be Isaiah chapter. We'll fix it right here in live on screen. 7, 1 to 17. Apologies about that, and sorry to the folks on Sunday. 7, 1 to 17, that's where that quote comes from within that passage. Specifically, oh, now I think I did that wrong too. Hold on. Isn't it great when your teacher doesn't have their lesson prepared? Huh. Okay, well, I want to make sure I'm giving you the right passage, so let's find it. Apologies, folks. Here we go. Matthew 7:14. How? It is. Okay. 7, 1 through 14. I just don't know what I'm talking about, folks. Apologies. So Isaiah 7, 1 to 14 is the full passage. And the specific verse is chapter 7, verse 14. There we go. Sorry about that. A little background for you. This is a time of conflict for God's people in Isaiah. The passage that Matthew cites is in the midst of that conflict, with warnings of war and exile. The sign of the young woman, and there's a lot of scholarly debate about the word that's translated into English as virgin, depending on if you look at it Greek or Aramaic or Hebrew, could have been young woman. I'm not going to get into that right now, whether it was young woman or virgin. Because in the end, what actually is significant in terms of this comparison is how will God intervene in the conflict? If you set the virgin slash young woman debate aside, the main point has more to do with Emmanuel, God with us. So what did that mean in Isaiah? What did that mean in Matthew? Does that give you any insight? Go ahead and pause the video, dig into it, come back. Okay, I'm assuming you paused. If not, we're back. Number 2, Matthew 4, 9 through 10, and Deuteronomy 6, 13. So Matthew 4, 9 to 10, we've moved into that conversation between Jesus and the devil during the temptation in the wilderness. 4, 9, and 10 says, the devil says, "All these I will give you if you will fall down and worship me." Jesus said to him, "Away with you, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve only him." So if you go all the way back to Deuteronomy chapter 6, this is shortly after the Shema, which is a very important passage in the Hebrew Bible, in 6:4. But when you get to 6:13, it says, "The Lord your God you shall fear, him you shall serve, and by his name alone you shall swear." But I want you to read that fuller passage of Deuteronomy. Give it some context. Just a small bit of background on that. This passage from Deuteronomy is on the verge of the Israelites finally entering the promised land after those 40 years in the wilderness. In Matthew, consider how often the disciples worship Jesus after he performs a sign or miracle. Jesus turns down the devil, but who is Jesus to everyone else? Are we to worship him? What would that mean if we were, especially in the light of that law just spelled out in Deuteronomy? Also, and I don't know why I didn't type this, in the wilderness, right before entering the promised land, Jesus in the wilderness being tempted by the devil. So dig into that, pause it, come back. All right, welcome back. If you paused, the next one is from Matthew chapter 12. And verses 1 through 14 is the full passage. If you look at Matthew 1 through 8, it's Jesus going through the cornfields on the Sabbath, and he kind of gets yelled at by the Pharisees. You're not supposed to work on the Sabbath. And so Jesus says, have you not read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? Don't you know the Sabbath guidelines? Well, what is he talking about here? So if you go to Numbers chapter 28, specifically verses 1, or generally verses 1 through 10, specifically verses 9 and 10. If you want to skim the rest of the chapter, you can, just to get into this mindset of Old Testament laws. But 28, 1 through 10, especially 9 and 10. 9 and 10. On the Sabbath day, 2 male lambs a year old without blemish, and 2/10 of an ephah of choice flour for a grain offering mixed with oil, and its drink offering. This is the burnt offering for every Sabbath, in addition to the regular burnt offering and its drink offering. Now, you might not feel like that's a direct quote. Well, Jesus is indirectly referencing Numbers 28 here, since the priests are commanded to do work on the Sabbath. Right? They need to find these goats or lambs and slaughter them and give the offering. That's work. But they're supposed to for God, for this offering, this worship, this sacrifice. So think of the implications of what Jesus says in Matthew 12:6 specifically. Also consider that the book of Matthew wasn't written down in print until after the second temple had been destroyed by the Romans. What does that mean in terms of worship and offering and sacrifice? Also consider the function of this passage of Numbers for God's people, where they were, again, in the wilderness, when they were given these laws. Compare that to what's going on with Matthew. So go ahead and pause this, dig into Matthew 12 and Numbers 28, and then come back. Okay, welcome back again. Matthew 25, um, and the whole passage is 31 through 46 for the verses. 25:40 is, Jesus talking about, well, the parable, whatever you did to the least of these, you did to me. That's a very important passage for me, particularly. That informs a lot of my ethics. How do you treat other people? Um, Now, this is not a direct quote either. This is looking back, one author suggests, at Proverbs 19:17, which says, "Whoever is kind to the poor lends to the Lord and will be repaid in full." Um, so this is Matthew's well-known story about sheep and goats separated, the left and the right. The least of these, what you do positively or negatively to the least of these, you're also doing to the king, to the Lord. So it could be making a reference to this verse in Proverbs. Whoever is kind to the poor lends to the Lord will be repaid in full. Okay? But unlike the other ones we've been doing, Proverbs, it's a list. It's not a narrative. It's not a prophecy. Proverbs was just a list. I mean, read any of the verses on either side of this, and it feels just like a random assortment of, wisdom. Sometimes it even contradicts itself, it feels like. So what does it mean to quote Proverbs? Does that change the character or the authenticity of the reference or its impact? So go ahead and read that whole passage from Matthew 25. Look at Proverbs 19:17 and around it and see what you think. Pause it. Come on back in a second. Okay, welcome back one last time, or almost the last time, second to last time. Matthew 28, I mentioned this at the outset. Matthew 28, verse 20 says, teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. Remember, I am with you always to the end of the age. And just as an example of other times in the Old Testament where God promises to be with the people, you can go back to Genesis chapter 28, specifically verse 15, but also the whole passage is verses 10 through 22. Verse 15 says, "Know that I am with you and will keep you wherever you go and will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you." It's part of Jacob's dream, Jacob's ladder, that passage. This is, Jacob slash Israel, the new name that he gets, is about to cross the threshold of a river to confront the brother, Esau, that he wronged so long ago. Jesus is on the threshold, if you look at Luke and Acts, of ascension, going up to heaven. So, what does this one mean? Promise for God to be with you always. What does that mean? What does it mean for Matthew to use that language, knowing how often it comes up in the Old Testament, including this passage here? So go ahead and pause, read Matthew 28, 16 through 20, read Genesis 28, 10 through 22, and then come on back. All right, welcome back. One more thing. These are just 5 examples. Remember, I said there's between 54 to 61 direct quotes, hundreds of other references and allusions, possibly. These are just 5. There's a lot more. Some are obvious. Some are what one author, I think it was this guy, either way, one of these two. One of them calls them, there's something they call shadow stories, right? So for instance, is the story of King Herod slaughtering the innocent children, is that shadowing or echoing the story of Pharaoh ordering the deaths of the Israelite infants at the beginning of Exodus? Moses ends up in the basket to escape that order. So if that is the case, if the story of King Herod slaughtering the innocents calls to mind, especially for the Jewish Christians who believed Jesus was the Messiah at the very beginning, including the disciples, did what Herod do bring to mind what Pharaoh did? And if so, Herod calls himself the king of the Jews. Does that mean he's a king like Pharaoh was a king, a ruler of enslaved Jews? Which then later on in the gospel, if Jesus is saying, or others are saying he's the king of the Jews, does that contrast then highlight Jesus as the true king? if Herod is slaughtering folks like Pharaoh did, and Jesus has the Last Supper, which then is like the new Exodus covenant, the new covenant in my blood, freed from slavery to sin instead of freed from slavery. So do you get to see how this works now? It all has these layers. And if you start getting into what Luther called the cradle of Christ, the swaddling cloths of Christ that was, the Old Testament that Jesus was wrapped in, that the New Testament is wrapped in, it adds more to what the New Testament is saying. So, having some degrees in biblical languages might help you dig into this stuff. Most folks don't have that. I don't have degrees in biblical languages. I studied them. I don't use them. It's in there. It's rusty. I have a whole shelf full of books right over here that help me. But if you don't want to get into biblical languages, you can have a good study Bible and just do the digging that you've done today during the pauses of reading side by side and seeing what hits you. Anybody can start this exploration process. Um, so my question for the last question is, what will you take away from today's conversation? I'd love to hear about it. Let me know. Shoot me an email, give me a call, put some comments in the videos, but let me know what you think of this. Next week, a little more structured, a little more guided. We'll get into the Gospel of Mark on October 1st. We'll record our conversation across the hall here at church. But thanks for watching this. We'll get this and the PDF posted, and I hope you get some good things. So until next time, thank you for watching, and we'll see you later. Blessings.